the way back to 1990. And black political organization, I hope Mr. Rice is in here, is complicit in this process by agreeing to create an all-black congressional district in the Sewell, Congressman Sewell district today. You also created an two ultra-conservative white district in the process. Now, how do you change that? Now, Montgomery County is a perfect example of gerrymandering. 3 congressional districts in one county. That doesn't make any sense. But in order to create this one black congressional district, Montgomery County has to be carved up.
But initially, Montgomery County was not carved up. It was in the second redistricting effort. And that's why minorities need to mobilize themselves, and we can do that because we have local organizations. It was not carved up until that second.
Here, Dixie. I say, go back and look at the writing of C. Borden Gray and the confirmation of Clarence Thomas, and you will get a better understanding of the redistricting and the effort that goes on throughout the South and the nation, and it previews the rise of what we call the Tea Party today. Guys, those guys are representing their districts. You may not like it, but they are representing their district. I'm sorry.
And that's why Shelby was so important as a review process.
Okay, this question is for Dr. Norrell, but any of the panelists can answer afterwards. Paulette Horton of Mobile wrote a book called 60 Days to Death, which she implies that Booker T. Washington was murdered. And based on your discussion, he was into a lot of things. So do you and other panelists think that Booker T. Washington was murdered to silence him?
Yeah, I had quite extensive conversation with Ms. Horton about this. I think Booker T. Washington had some angry, ugly enemies that the historical record has not noted. Tom Heflin, a lot of other noted politicians and political figures. He had a few friends, like I mentioned, Thomas Booth Jones, but he had many whites who detested him for the reason that they saw that Booker Washington's strategy, his plan was a plan to have blacks rise to full equality in American life. It's going to take a long time, but they understood, and they hated him for it. But I don't think that whites were really involved in the death of Booker Washington. I don't think he was murdered. I think he died of natural causes, severe heart disease, and there's. I think the record, as much record as we know, and I examined what Ms. Horton sent me, and I just wasn't persuaded of that. By 1915, he was somewhat removed from the center of public eye, and he was there was less overt opposition to him.
I'd just like to add, if you don't mind.
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee took a lot from Booker T. Washington in terms of a section of us, in terms of planning our strategies. We began to recognize that Booker T. said you had to have an economic development, your own economic independence and consolidation. And from there, you will rise up to fight for these other unnecessary things like politics and, and social interaction. And we dubbed him the father of Black Power. Booker T. Washington, in retrospect, I wrote an article for it in the Tuskegee Campus Digest. He was very much involved with organized black labor and business. He was president of all of those kinds of associations simultaneously with being an educator. And if we look at any of the old ASTA records, Association of State Teachers or something, the black, he was very instrumental in forming that and putting women out front. So Booker T was a multifaceted person. The whole so-called squabble between him and W.E.B. Du Bois was really fabricated. Some of us felt that maybe Du Bois fell into it, got caught up in it around this Talent 10th, which Booker T did not favor. So it was the whole, meanwhile now, Booker T led a very luxurious life. He was on par and above a whole heap of white folks with his own train car. So I urge you to read Professor Norrell's book, and also read Manning Marable, our late Manning Marable from Tuskegee, he wrote the book on Malcolm X. Read his writings on Booker T. So as we study black historical figures who really factor into our voting rights struggle, we need to know all of these folks. And just another tidbit, Horace Mann Bond wrote a beautiful piece on Alabama education, and he was the father to Julian Bond, who was in SNCC along with us. Thank you.
And you need to
Just
read the writings of W.E.B. Du Bois
Yes,
to
we
get
know.
the other perspective as well.
Just something I'm taking in with Dr. Norrell again, because Dr. Norrell mentioned that Thomas Helton and others were this vehement disgust with Booker T. Washington, but in truth it was not always that way, because when Booker T. Washington presented his address in 1895 in September in Atlanta, many of these individuals loved what they thought he was saying. It was only when he began to object to what the 1901 Constitution was going to do to black folks and to poor white folks that they all of a sudden then began to disassociate themselves with Booker T. Washington. Before that, they put political power, they put economic power into Tuskegee. Likewise with W.E.B. Du Bois. It's a wonderful tool that's used. You create falsities and then you sort of co-opt the individuals who you want to be co-opted. And this entire idea about W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington having this great challenge of each other simply is not true. From W.E.B. Du Bois wanting to come to Tuskegee, to the continued participation of Du Bois and Washington to fight against grandfather clauses, to fight against poll taxes. Professor Norrell said that it was Booker T. Washington's money, yes, but it was much of W.E.B. Du Bois's research to tend in with Professor Patton to say that, well, there was this whole Negro League and there was a rift. Booker T. Washington stole the idea from W.E.B. Du Bois. Well, actually, the Booker T. Washington papers at the Library of Congress don't suggest that. They suggest that W.E.B. Du Bois actually allowed Booker T. Washington to take the lead. Why else would Du Bois want to come to Tuskegee other than to be with the most powerful black person in the country? So again, to me, it's the continued ignorance of the historical record that needs to be corrected. And once we do that, just like some individuals who will vote against their self-interest politically, once that ignorance is corrected, I think we'll have a far more enlightened exchange and involvement.
I'd just like to pose I guess it's a question for the panelists. You have spent, I guess, your professional life at least researching and studying and all of this business that has taken place in our great country of the United States of America, beginning with, for the past 200 or 300 years, beginning with slavery and coming on up to the current day, 2013. And I have spent, I guess, most of all of my life trying to understand what lies at the root of all this. Is it, we say racism, of course, but what has given rise to that racism that we experience in this country, that we have experienced from the beginning, that has seeped into and actually directed our laws, you know, the Constitution of the United States of America, the Alabama constitutions, you know, you've mentioned several of those. What is it? Is it hatred? Is it hatred of black people who have been here from the very beginning, just like the white folks have been here? Is it that hatred? What causes this hatred? I mean, do you have any, this is something that I think about all the time, and especially now that I have time, I'm retired, so I have time to keep up with Barack Obama and all this, and the more I listen, you know, to things that are happening in the world today, the more I wonder, you know, and try to understand how it is that a Christian nation, and especially the South, you know, we are all kind of Christians, evangelicals, we are Christians, and we do not, in terms of the way black people have undergone all of the things that you talked about here with voting rights, for example, to keep us from voting, lynching, just a whole lot of, and you know, you can think of, I get really emotional when I think about all this stuff, because you can just look at the way we have been treated in this country. What is at the root of it? Is it a power struggle? Then why? Is it racism, hatred? Why? That's what I want to know. What is your take on that? How do you think about that? How do you think about that? Because I think about it all the time, and I never come up with any answers. You know, I look at this debacle that took place this week, you know, the last 16 days with the Congress, you know, and you hear all this, I mean, it's just somebody waving the Confederate flag at the Capitol, you know, it's just, what is it? Tell me, what do you think it is?
Fear. Fear.
Well, in political science, we have a term called political socialization. I'd like to kind of do a little doctorate on that and move it on over to maybe, well, I don't have to doctor it. People learn their orientations early and how they feel about other people. And if you look at parenting and teaching your children how to feel about the world in general, once the child grows up and comes into contact with other people, they may alter those conceptions or orientations. But I contend that what they are taught early is basic. Somebody said fear, yes. Ignorance, yes.
Fear of what?
It's fear of losing power. It's fear of losing power, change, competition. That's all it could be, because
So we are always the targets. You know, it's always.
But if you learn early that I am your enemy for reasons unexplainable, then you take that throughout life. So everything you see, even the achievement of a black president, you're not going to give him credit, because deep down in your psyche, you have been taught.
But where did it all begin?
I say it with the family, in my opinion.
But with what family? At what point? At what point?
Well, we talked about Southern society. We talked about Southern culture. You know, there was no need to change the advancement for voting rights for black people. I mean, there was no need to not accept black people into American society.
Did it start on the slave ship? On the way to crossing the Atlantic?
Where you justify slavery.
Well, let me put it like this. It seems to me that the way that American society emerged, whites had extraordinary power and advantages in the racial arrangements, and whether it was slavery or the arrangement after slavery, so that all the benefits of black labor, for example, were expected to go to benefit white people. And the thing, of course, that challenged that was if by the Civil War and the end of slavery and the promise of equality, the 14th, 15th Amendment, what challenged that was black people gaining political power, or in the case of the Booker Washington Plan, economic power. And whites have fundamentally understood or assumed that, believed that when a black person rises, gains political power, economic power, influence, whites lose. And this is the fundamental dynamic was, you know, if blacks go up, whites have to go down. And whites, as the majority in this country, have had the power, the influence in politics and the economy to enforce their superior advantages, with the extraordinary exception of things that happened in the civil rights movement. So there was some interruption of that. But I contend it's really just an interruption, that the impulse of whites to act so that their advantage over blacks continues, and particularly that blacks do not gain political power to sufficiently influence society. And the thing about Barack Obama is he is a huge symbol of blacks gaining political power. Now, you and I know that he hasn't acted all that much in particular black interests, but to whites who are hostile to black people having political power, and as I said, that's the vast majority of white people, he is a symbol of their not having the influence that historically they have had, and that we think we are due, because obviously I'm white. But it is astonishing. Did you know that in the election in which Obama was called the food stamp president, the 250 counties in this country that had the highest food stamp recipients, Mitt Romney won 213 of them. And the county with the single highest recipients of food stamps is a county in Kentucky that is all white. 81% of them voted for Romney. So what you have is an extraordinary development of white people voting against their economic and, I'd argue, political interests, and even their, you referred to religion, even their avowed faith in Christianity, in order to preserve their racial advantage.
Go ahead,
Fear. Somebody said fear.
That's it.
Is it the fear that the tables may be turned?
Yes.
Yes. That's what created the 1901
Yeah, we
Constitution.
might put them in.
The fear of that coalition of poor whites and poor blacks coming together. Today, it's the demographic change that's driving it, and Barack Obama represents the symbol of that change. It's fear.
I mean, you hear all the time folks talk about the collapse of Western civilization as it's known, and this is not something that's done in the abstract. Professor Norrell mentioned the county in Kentucky again. We're talking about 98% of that county is white, and it has one of the largest voting blocks. It was in excess of 80% of those individuals, and they are welfare recipients who voted against Barack Obama, who sought to expand that plan. But it becomes even more, I think, concrete when one looks at some of the video footage of, not Mississippi, I can't think of his name, he's one of the late night talk show hosts, but in essence what he did was to go in the streets of the city where the show, Jimmy Kimmel, and he went in the streets of where the show was filmed, and he asked white persons what they felt about Obamacare versus the Affordable Care Act, which is the Affordable Care Law. And when Jimmy spoke about the Affordable Care Act, those individuals said, well, I like it. But when he called it Obamacare, they hated it. It's the exact same platform now. All you did was roll out, and then finally he told one of the women, he said, well, you know that the Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act are the same thing. And she said, well, you made a fool out of me, didn't you? But it's the mere stamp of it being Obama. It's wrong. If it's anything else, then it's okay. But simply because this mixed ethnic race president has that percentage of, quote, African blood, unquote, that's what makes it disgusting. And it's almost because for many of these individuals, I really want the program, I just don't want this person to help me get the program.
And if you're gonna distinguish poor whites or working class whites from
Upper economic whites, just look at Shelby County. I've often asked myself, and maybe I can dig a little deeper once I get a chance to write this paper. That paper, I had to write this one. Shelby County is the richest county in Alabama. And it seems to me, maybe, it seems to me interesting that suit challenging the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act would come from Shelby County. Not necessarily from Alabama, but from Shelby County, Alabama.
Do you have any more questions? Right here.
I just wanted to make a comment really about the Tea Party and these kind of aspirational politics, the idea about people voting or working against their own self-interest. That a central facet of the Tea Party wing of the Republican Party has been this opposition to the Obama presidency on the grounds that the spending is out of control and that they're wasting too much taxpayer money and all the rest. There was an article in Forbes magazine I was looking at yesterday in mid-May of this year that was saying that from the 2010 through the 2012 budget year, that President Obama's spending has only risen 1.4% over any previous spending, which is the lowest level since when Bill Clinton was in office, and is far and below any of the Republican presidents who have been in office since Jimmy Carter was in office. And so there's a huge misperception out there, but so much of this stuff is driven off of ignorance, fear, the big lie, and on and on and on.
You have any more time? Questions for any more?
One more.
This young man has, if you let somebody ask.
Let's go with the back one.
And then I think we're done, you all. Last question.
I just came in, I'm kind of late. I hear a lot of dialogue, but what do we do, because we talking about Caucasian people, but what do we do when black politicians have the same ideology as white politicians, and they run and say they're going to do this and do that, but they don't do that? How do we hold them accountable? That's what I want to know. And that's to everybody in the room and everybody on the panel. Thank you.
The answer is voting.
That's not what I asked. I said when you voted them in, they run on this platform, but they don't do nothing of what they said they do.
But that's just our system. It corrects itself
How else you gonna do it?
through the electoral process.
But you just showed us how they have over years sought to disfranchise black folks, and they still doing it. So how do we combat these efforts, these current efforts, to take the vote away from us?
Voting.
Okay, you have to start earlier. And it's an educational process. I think that's what
So
I
how
was
do you
alluding
vote?
to earlier.
How do you vote?
Understand what's going
How
on.
do you vote?
That's the educational process.
Like in North Carolina, what did they do? They took they don't let the students vote anymore. I mean, it's just a whole lot of
But you in your own
ways to keep folks from voting. So what do you do?
This is just a part.
If they succeed in keeping you from voting.
Well, remember, 1901.
We'll touch on something.
Disfranchisement of black, but it also disenfranchised a majority of poor whites. It took the 1965 Voting Rights Act to bring them back into the electoral process.
They weakened it.
And
But you have within your own organizations, you have sometimes political committees, you have, like I said earlier, I think the greatest fault that African Americans shared and that shall be ruling, in my opinion, we should have been aware that something like this was coming. And because there have been talk about maximizing power, black people having.
Get to that awareness.
But you have, I mean, you can't make everybody get to the awareness,
You can't
but you
force
start at your local kinds of committees. Politics is local. And the bottom line is that you start talking about these things and you examine the political climate and you try to anticipate what move is going to be made. I don't play checkers, but I understand that's how it's done. So that's the best way I can say. But if you feel like you have achieved, and I think maybe that was implied in his question, you're not looking for the faults in the system.
okay, guys, I've been told we need to cut it off for lunch. Okay.
We got 2 minutes.
2 minutes, Mr. Lane.
I got 2 minutes. Okay, Dr. Freeman, concerning your question about from the very beginning, when I was in the military, I was going to race relations school, and the sergeant came to me, he said, well, Lane, have you ever heard of the carrot theory? I said, no, I haven't heard of the carrot theory. So he said, on top of the ground is the green leafy part of the carrot. That's equal housing, that's job discrimination, what have you. He said the main part of the carrot is underground, and the main part of not sexual tension, but race tension is the sexual relationship between a black man and a white woman, and it's always has been that way. If you read the book Slavery by Another Name, it actually states that that is the problem in the beginning.
Okay, that's it.
Interesting comment. Guys, we appreciate everyone coming out. Please return for the afternoon session starting at.
Make it 1:30, please.
Something to say from the side. We're going to let the panelists go first, and then we'll come back to you. And I guess we'll go by the order on the paper, Dr. Audrey. We're going to be starting with you, and unless I need to, you will not see me again until I get ready to present Dr. Robinson. So panelists, fall in.
Good afternoon. On December 5th, 1955, African American leaders in Montgomery, Alabama, organized a group which guided the city's 50,000 black citizens in an assault against discriminatory bus service, the organization was called the Montgomery Improvement Association. The move came in the wake of the arrest of a 42-year-old seamstress and secretary of the Montgomery National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Rosa Parks, for refusing to relinquish her seat on a Montgomery bus to a white passenger. For 382 days, the MIA galvanized the class-torn Montgomery black community in a united struggle against a system which had deprived them of constitutional rights as well as human dignity. In the decade prior to the Montgomery bus boycott, the Montgomery branch of the NAACP confronted voting rights injustices, giving it a place in the events which culminated in the 1965 voting rights movement in Alabama. Most importantly, the branch's voting rights initiatives reflected in many ways the same spirit of defiance evident among blacks in the Montgomery bus boycott. Few African Americans in Montgomery likely predicted that in the 1940s, the branch of the NAACP possessed the vision and fortitude to execute a civil rights crusade, particularly one challenging violations of blacks' right to vote. The branch had been founded in 1918 and was the oldest NAACP unit in Alabama. Its middle-class organizers saw the branch as a local reflection, at least to some degree, of its militant parent office. The national agency of the NAACP had been established in 1909 with the goal of securing blacks' full first-class constitutional rights. By the time of the Montgomery branch formation in 1918, the national office of the NAACP was viewed by blacks in Montgomery and around the nation as the chief advocate of African American rights as United States citizens. Montgomery black newspapers informed African Americans in the city of the national office's successful challenges to racial injustice, including the national office challenge of the Grandfather Clause, discrimination against blacks in World War I, discrimination in housing, and the unjust treatment of blacks unfairly charged with the crimes against whites. The new branch began with a spurt of energy and was well received within the Montgomery black community. The branch gained hundreds of members within a short period, and a local black newspaper called the branch a great organization. Shortly after its formation, the branch listed voting rights as one of its objectives. But before the chapter could carry out this goal, a split took place within the branch of rival factions. The split was over who would attend the 1919 NAACP National Conference in Cleveland, Ohio. Fear over physical reprisal from whites determined to maintain white supremacy also kept this first NAACP branch in Montgomery from stepping outside the boundaries of an acceptable black code of conduct in a racially restrictive society. Chief among the factors contributing to the Montgomery branch's failure at first to execute a voting rights initiative in the 1920s was the sheer difficulty of overturning voting rights discrimination in the state. In 1901, Alabama introduced a new constitution aimed at eliminating the black vote. That constitution used a poll tax and annual fee to be paid by a prospective voter from the age of 21 to 45 to deny thousands of black Alabamians the franchise of the vote. Another major device intended to disfranchise black voters in Alabama was the literacy test. This device called for a would-be voter to be able to read and explain the United States Constitution. Prior to the passage of the Constitution, 180,000 blacks voted in the state. It's 1901. By 1903, this number had been reduced to only 3,000. In 1929, a reorganized Montgomery branch of the NAACP reinstituted a voting rights goal. The next year, approximately only 1,800 blacks are voting in the state. Montgomery black voters by this time numbered less than 50. But the branch's new crop of leaders were likely inspired by the parent office's voting rights legal cases against the white primary. Alabama and other southern states had instituted the white primary to deny the ballot to already registered voters who were black. This measure barred African Americans from voting in a Democratic Party nominating election. Forbidding blacks from voting in a primary election in a one-party state like Alabama meant the black vote was really entirely shut out of the entire electoral process. In 1932, the NAACP legal department, its national office, in the case Nixon versus Condon, persuaded the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn a Texas white primary law. 2 years later, the Montgomery NAACP set out to challenge Alabama's white primary state law. This included the president of the state normal school, later Alabama State University, Harper Council Trenum. Nothing came of this attempt to ensure black suffrage rights, likely because of Montgomery's 1930s branch suffered from the same maladies afflicting its predecessor, internal division and fear of white reprisal. However, the next decade saw the Montgomery branch of the NAACP in the forefront of a voting rights crusade in Alabama capital city. Objective for the Montgomery branch in the 1940s. New visionary leadership, courageous leadership, determined leadership figured prominently among the many factors bringing about this new surprising turn of events for the Montgomery branch of the 1940s. The background of these leaders and their sense of mission resurrected the vision of the branch's original founders, that the chapter would become a bulwark against racial injustice, as was the national NAACP parent office. E.D. Nixon and Rosa Parks were central to the branch's new voting initiatives. E.D. Nixon joined the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP in the late 1930s and early 1940s. He was from the working class and had no more than a third-grade education. But he soon took the branch into the heart of the voting rights struggle in this city. Nixon had already established himself as a respected leader in the black community, unafraid to speak out on behalf of his people. Nixon's job as a Pullman porter placed him on the nation's railroads, which took him to several major cities in the Midwest and Northeast. On one of these trips, in the late 1920s, Nixon met A. Philip Randolph, the black activist who had organized in 1925 the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, a union of Pullman porters like Nixon. It was Randolph who had challenged Nixon and other Pullman porters to return to their hometowns and institute a movement to liberate their people. In the 1930s, Nixon had organized the Montgomery Welfare League to aid blacks to make ends meet during the Great Depression. He had also become head of the Montgomery unit of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in the late 1930s. But Nixon likely saw the NAACP as an organization best capable of challenging the state's denial of blacks' right to vote. As head of the branch's executive committee in the 1940s, Nixon carried out his vision for a branch which set out an activist agenda for achieving blacks' full voting rights. The chapter directed its attention to expanding Montgomery's black electoral power to challenging the literacy test. As mandated by the 1901 Alabama Constitution, again, this measure called for a prospective voter to be able to read and explain the U.S. Constitution. E.D. Nixon, who was to become president of the branch in the mid to late 1940s, and Rosa Parks branch secretary, and some of the more highly educated blacks in this city failed this examination. Not because of its difficulty, but they failed it because the literacy test, which registrars possessed discretionary power to ask questions of the would-be voter of their own design. The voting white registrars often quiz black voting applicants on matters not directly related to the test itself. Even correct answers to the standard questions on the test were usually rejected by the white voting registrars. In the 1940s, few blacks have been willing to endure the humiliation and discrimination involved in attempting to register to vote. Some, like Harper Council Trenum, the president of the State Normal School, now ASU, have been a voter since the 1930s. Trenum may have obtained a ballot by virtue of his ability to pass the literacy test, and of course by paying his poll tax. Trenum was one of the few blacks that the white power structure permitted to register to vote in this city, in order to curry, perhaps favor, with the black middle class. Also, Trenum could have been allowed to vote so that the state would not appear a wholesale violator of the U.S. Constitution. E.D. Nixon had also taken the literacy test 3 different times before he was cleared to vote in 1945, but only after he threatened a lawsuit against the Board of Registrars. In the fall of 1943, the Montgomery branch, under Nixon's direction, initiated its crusade for the rights of blacks to vote by targeting the blatantly racist literacy test. It invited Montgomery native and New York lawyer Arthur E. Madison to help generate a lawsuit based on proof that election officials systematically deprived African Americans of the suffrage by unfairly administering the examination. Madison had been born in 1888 in Madison Park, an all-black community north of Montgomery, and had been named for his family. After graduating from the State Normal School, ASU, in 1904, he received his bachelor's degree from a college in Maine. 6 years later, he graduated from New York's Columbia Law School. For several months in Montgomery, between late 1943 and early 1944, Madison conducted citizenship classes, training black volunteers, including Rosa Parks and perhaps even Nixon, in the intricacies of the literacy examination. In the fall of 1943, Madison led several of his students in his voting school to the county courthouse to take the literacy test. The branch and Madison anticipated that most, if not all of them, would be turned down from passing the test. Madison and the branch would follow through then with the long-awaited voting rights test case. As expected, the Montgomery Board of Registrars rejected all of Madison's applicants. Then the attorney charged the board with violating the voting rights of his 16 clients. Local white authorities had discovered that they could get around this kind of legal confrontation by qualifying a few of the voting applicants to vote. However, in this occasion, they chose to remove the source of the trouble itself. That was the lawyer, Madison. In February 1944, the Board of Registrars charged Madison with using the names of 8 of his clients, including his niece, Sarah Pearl Madison, without their consent in the case. The allegation was based on actual complaints by several of Madison's plaintiffs, specifically the school teachers in this case, who had been intimidated into making the accusation against Madison on threat of losing their jobs. 2 months later, during April 1944, Madison found himself in Montgomery's Court of Common Pleas on a charge that could have ended his efforts and that of the branch to strike down the literacy test. Even worse, the allegations could result in Madison being barred from practicing law in Alabama. The Court of Common Pleas declared Madison guilty of the charges against him. Later that year, Madison lost his appeal against the charges in the Circuit Court and the Alabama Supreme Court. He was forced to pay a $2,500 fine and was denied the privilege of legal practice in the state. But the lawyer was not quite ready to leave the state. On June 13, 1944, Madison and E.D. Nixon led a group of 750 blacks to the county courthouse to protest against the right to vote. Perhaps in order to deflect any additional attention from a bad situation, the board enrolled a few of the prominent voting rights activists at that time. Nixon's work as a voting rights activist was not limited to the Montgomery NAACP in the 1940s. He believed that the franchise was a key to the advancement of blacks as citizens in the nation. In 1943 again, Nixon formed the Montgomery Voters League. His goal was to, quote, sell the people on the idea of full citizenship and that they could really be free if they made up their minds that they really wanted to be free. From May to October that year, Nixon carried the voting rights message to various counties in the state. And again, on June 13, 1944, Nixon and Attorney Madison marched 750 blacks to the county voting rights office demanding the right to be registered. From the low number of 50 voting rights marchers that the county registrars had qualified through this effort, and through other activists in the state, the number of black voters mounted significantly in the 1940s. Rosa Parks was another Montgomery NAACP officer in the 1940s who became a part of the chapter's goal of expanding the number of black voters in the city. Parks joined the NAACP in Montgomery in December 1943, and she was immediately appointed secretary of the chapter and was given the occupation or assignment of helping to organize the branch's voting rights campaign. Parks had tried to pass the literacy test at least twice before she was turned down, and she had carefully planned to appear at the county courthouse 1 or 2 days each month for the 2 hours a day the election officials took voting applications. She had contemplated suing the Board of Registrars after she had failed the examination. Parks finally passed the examination, or the board cleared her rather than risk legal repercussions. At any rate, Parks received a voting rights certificate in 1945, as had did Edie Nixon. Edie Nixon and Rosa Parks represented a new kind of leader in the Montgomery NAACP chapter of the 1940s, who saw voting rights as critical to blacks' advancement as citizens. Nixon and Parks were not the only leaders in Montgomery during the period who agitated for a blacks' right to vote. Rufus Lewis, former ASU football coach, organized a Citizens Committee which also championed blacks' 15th Amendment rights. Blacks of this period, in NAACP particularly, represented a spirit of defiance of laws which robbed African Americans of the right which best embodies American citizenship, that is the right to vote. Thus, Montgomery blacks and the NAACP projected blacks in this city as a courageous people, willing to endure possible physical or legal repercussions for rights promised them in the U.S. Constitution. So this situation of blacks and the NAACP of this period took place 20 years or so before the Voting Rights Campaign in Selma in 1965. Yet it represented a new step in blacks gaining rights essential to their being citizens of this country. Thank you.
Good afternoon. While the Montgomery Improvement Association, or the MIA, was established in 1955 on December 5th in order to coordinate the execution of the Montgomery bus boycott, within a year, the MIA would evolve into a general purpose civil rights organization animated by the collective energies of Montgomery's black population. At the successful conclusion of a year-long bus campaign, protest leadership established the MIA as a permanent civil rights organization, providing Montgomery's black population with a vehicle to address long-standing discriminatory practices, including an organization with wide enough reach to make inroads against voter disenfranchisement. What is the Montgomery Improvement Association? In 1955, during the summer, Rosa Parks attended Highlander Folk School in Monteagle, Tennessee. There, among the racially integrated workshops in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, Parks glimpsed a parallel reality, a world where black people were not subservient, where they were not dismissed or treated with disdain and contempt or relegated to separate living and eating quarters. At Highlander, Parks ate, talked, and socialized with white people on an equal basis. And she watched the black and white participants interact with each other with ease and comfort. It was here that the 42-year-old Parks resolved never to submit to the humiliation of having to relinquish her seat to a white bus rider. So on Thursday, December 1st, 1955, within months of her Highlander visit, and at the end of the long and exhausting day as a seamstress in the Montgomery Fair department store, Parks sat down on a city bus just behind the 10 front seats reserved for whites. When Parks ignored the order of the driver, James Blake, and refused to relinquish her seat to allow a white man to sit, she helped launch a new and particularly fruitful phase of the modern civil rights movement. The bus boycott, however, did not develop spontaneously after Parks' arrest. In 1955, Alabama State College teacher or professor Joanne Robinson served as the president of the Women's Political Council, the WPC, a group of middle-class black activists organized 9 years earlier by Robinson's Alabama State College colleague, Professor Mary Fairburks. Robinson saw the park's arrest as an opportunity to initiate a long-contemplated WPC plan to boycott Montgomery buses. So on December 1st, the night of Rosa Parks' arrest, Robinson conferred with her WPC officers who agreed to the action. The English professor then talked to Pullman Porter and NAACP President E.D. Nixon. Nixon, who bailed Rosa Parks out of jail, had in the previous months discouraged as inopportune several attempts to boycott Montgomery buses. After securing Nixon's support on the night of the 1st, Robinson shared WPC plans, boycott plans, with attorney Fred Gray. Later that night, Robinson used a mimeograph machine at the Alabama State College to run off 52,000 boycott announcements. The next day, Alabama State College students joined Robinson's WPC members to distribute leaflets announcing a one-day boycott throughout town. While Robinson prepared leaflets on the night of Parks' arrest, E.D. Nixon began to coordinate an organized response to the proposed boycott. He called a long list of local religious and lay leaders to promote the protest. High on Nixon's list were black ministers who could quickly mobilize their congregation. Coincidentally, a meeting of the Ministerial Alliance was scheduled for the next day. The labor organizer contacted First Baptist minister Ralph Abernathy and then Dexter Avenue Baptist Church minister Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Both men agreed to address the bus situation the next day, and they helped to make subsequent phone calls to solicit other ministers. King even accepted Nixon's request to host a meeting at his 87-year-old Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. The next day, Friday, December 2nd, Nixon was scheduled to work a train route and could not attend the meeting. He did, however, lay out his vision for action. Members of the Ministerial Alliance, club presidents, and other black leaders met in response to Nixon's call. The assemblage agreed to a one-day boycott and set the date for Monday, December 5th. They also prepared a new leaflet that reiterated the call for a boycott and announced a mass meeting at the Holt Street Baptist Church Monday evening after the boycott. On December 5th, black riders almost universally boycotted the city buses. For King, the action helped him internalize just how hungry black people were for change. Outside of King's parsonage home, only a few blocks from Alabama State College, he saw groups of black college boys walking with books tucked under sweated arms. King, Nixon, Abernathy, and other boycott leaders met at Mount Zion AME Zion Church to make arrangements for a mass meeting later that night. They prepared a list of moderate demands that did not seek to end segregation on the city buses, but only sought to modify segregation. During the course of the boycott, the NAACP's legal arm hesitated to lend support for a boycott-related challenge whose goals were to accommodate rather than end racial segregation. Over time, the MIA leadership would embrace the NAACP's uncompromising commitment to ending segregation altogether. But on the afternoon of December 5th, the key black leaders took action that would solidify an organizational response to discrimination on Montgomery buses. They opted to create a new organization to coordinate the bus boycott. Reverend Abernathy recommended the Montgomery Improvement Association as its name. And without any opposition, the black male leadership nominated and then elected Reverend Martin Luther King, a newcomer to the community, as president of the newly formed MIA. At this inaugural meeting, the participants also elected Reverend L.R. Bennett to the office of vice president, Reverend Uriah J. Fields as recording secretary, and Ms. Erna A. Dungy as financial secretary. That night, over 6,000 black Montgomeryans packed Mount Zion AME Church to hear more about the dynamic campaign to demonstrate their support. By couching racial discrimination in biblical terms of good versus evil, This first mass meeting placed the leadership of the movement in the familiar hands of the black preacher. The full-throated sermons of black ministers steeped the mass meetings in a spiritual milieu familiar to the black masses. The MIA worked out a formula for the mass meeting that assumed the trappings of a church service, animated by song and prayer, but also offering details about the protest and updates on negotiation with bus officials. As the boycott leader, King worked to place the aims of the movement within the best of the American and international protest tradition. In the mass meeting, King connected the mid-20th century protests to the traditions of civil disobedience established in the mid-19th century through individuals like David Henry Thoreau. He also couched their efforts within the 20th century tradition of pacifist resistance popularized by Mahatma Gandhi in India. With the church as a backdrop, participants were empowered to confront what they had previously thought were insurmountable obstacles of harassment, job losses, arrest, arson, and beating, and possibly death. The approach did not require that they overtly attack the system. It called for passive resistance. It required that they remain unified in refusing to support a system that systematically discriminated against it. The mass meeting was essential in communicating the nonviolent character of the movement. It allowed the MIA to spell out the goals of the campaign for the people and allowed the leadership to continue communicating week in and week out the ideas of nonviolent direct action. Finally, the meetings provided everyday people with a tangible way to participate in the fundamental decision-making process of a consequential campaign. During the first mass meeting, the people were asked if they wanted to continue the bus boycott until the demands had been met. It was the everyday people of Montgomery who voiced their preference. They would continue the campaign. The mass meeting gave the populace a voice in the direction of the movement. King and the MIA created an effective organizational structure. They established a 35-member executive board empowered to negotiate with Montgomery officials. From the beginning of the bus boycott, the executive committee met once a week, along with weekly and what became bi-weekly general mass meetings. Alabama State College Professor Joanne Robinson was tapped to edit the MIA newsletter, and Alabama State College football coach and librarian Rufus Lewis took over as chair of the Critical Transportation Committee. The general membership, however, was nebulous and ostensibly included the whole of Montgomery's black population. As any person believing in the equality of man and willing to embrace nonviolent ideals were encouraged to join the movement. The MIA increased pressure on white segregation by initiating a selective buying campaign. Inflammatory comments made by white business persons in response to the bus boycott prompted the city's black population to widen this campaign of economic pressure. Businessmen attending a white citizens council meeting at the state coliseum called black boycotters, many of whom were their customers, black devils or two-legged agitators. With 5,000 white supremacists in attendance, one person stated, "Whites are created equal with certain rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of dead niggas." This type of rhetoric became commonplace at white citizen council meetings in Montgomery and throughout the South. As these statements were made public, black customers began to shift even more of their trade away from local white businesses. Black citizens also targeted specific companies like the local milk company and the Coca-Cola distributor. One estimate had that white merchants in Montgomery lost $2 million of revenue during the bus boycott. Some black customers decided to purchase only essentials from white stores, thereby increasing their reliance on African-American merchants. The MIA responded to stalemated negotiations by initiating a litigation. In February of 1956, 2 months after fruitless negotiations, attorney Fred Gray finally convinced the MIA leadership to file suit to challenge bus segregation. The case targeted separate seating head-on and moved the MIA into line with the NAACP's uncompromising assault on segregation itself. a willingness to appeal to the courts allowed the MIA to couple nonviolent direct action with litigation and negotiation, thereby creating a formula that would define the modern civil rights movement to be replicated throughout the course of the next decade in thousands of locations throughout the nation. On May 11th, on behalf of Aurelia Browder and 3 additional female defendants, a 3-judge federal court ruled segregated seating violated the 14th Amendment in the Browder versus Gale case. In November, the Supreme Court upheld the ruling, and on December 20th, 1956, the U.S. Marshal formally served a Supreme Court order forbidding bus segregation on Montgomery officials. Even before the end of the year-long bus boycott,